Welcome to Sleep Through History Original.
On a cool October evening in 2011, a light went out in a brown house on a quiet street in Palo Alto, California. Inside, the windows were open because he had asked for that. He wanted to feel the air. The trees outside were old California oaks, their leaves barely stirring in the dusk, and the last light of the sun was fading behind the Santa Cruz Mountains to the west, turning the sky a deep, quiet amber. The house was not large, not by the standards of a man who had been, at various points in his life, worth more than their $7 million. It was a red brick house, built in the 1930s, on a street lined with hedges and bicycle, and the kind of ordinary American life that this man had never quite lived, but had always, in some way, longed for. He lay in bed, thin now, thinner than anyone who had known him in his years of power would have believed possible. His cheekbones, always sharp, now pressed against the skin like stone beneath paper. His hands, those hands that had held up devices in front of thousands of people and changed the way the world communicated, lay still on the blanket. His wife was beside him. His children were in the house. His sister had flown in from Los Angeles. She would later write that his final word, his very last word, was a whisper. Oh, wow. Oh, wow. Oh, wow. 이 부분은 볼륨 다운 요청, 길게. That was how Steve Jobs died. Quietly, in a house he loved, surrounded by the people he had not always been gentle with, but who loved him anyway. He was 56 years old. He had built the most valuable company on earth. He had changed the way human beings listen to music, make phone calls, read books, take photographs, and talk to one another. He had been fired from the company he created and then returned to save it from bankruptcy, and then turned it into the most successful business in the history of the world. And he had done all of it. Every product, every keynote, every decision, every beautiful, maddening, brilliant, cruel thing, with a mind that never stopped reaching for something just beyond the edge of what was possible. He called it one more thing. thing. There was always one more thing. Until there wasn't. 이 부분은 볼륨 다운 요청, 길게. Hello, I'm Edmund, and this is Sleep Through History. Tonight, we're going to tell the story of Steve Jobs, not the myth, not the legend printed on magazine covers or projected onto keynote stages. We're going to tell the human story, the full story, from a baby given away at birth in San Francisco in 1955 to a man who changed the entire world and then ran out of time at 56. This is a story about genius, but also about cruelty, about vision, but also about blindness, about a man who could see the future more clearly than almost anyone who ever lived, but who could not, for the longest time, see the people standing right in front of him. Our main sources tonight include Walter Isaacson's authorized biography, Steve Jobs, published in 2011, the only biography Jobs personally cooperated with before his death. We'll also draw from Brent Schlender and Rick Tetzeli's Becoming Steve Jobs, published in 2015, which many of Jobs' closest colleagues considered a more accurate portrait of the man they knew. And will reference Andy Hertzfeld's Revolution in the Valley, a first-hand account of the original Macintosh team, as well as interviews and keynote recordings from Apple's own archives. Tonight also carries a particular resonance. Just 11 days ago, on April 1st, 2026, Apple celebrated its 50th anniversary. 50 years since two young men in a garage in Los Altos, California, decided to build a computer. The company they created is now worth more than $3 trillion. It has shaped the daily life of billions of people, and it all began with a boy who was given away and spent his entire life trying to prove that he mattered. So settle in. Adjust your pillow. Let the day leave your shoulders. And if you feel like it, close your eyes. This is the story of Steve Jobs. And we're going to start at the very beginning with a door that closed and a door that opened. 이 부분은 볼륨 다운 요청, 길게. Chapter 1. The Boy Nobody Chose. On February 24th, 1955, in San Francisco, winter rain was soaking the hills of the city. Joanne Schiebel was 23 years old. She was a graduate student from Wisconsin, and the baby's father was Abdul Fattah Jandali, a Syrian graduate student. Joanne's father would not allow the relationship. She decided to put the baby up for adoption. There was only one condition. The adoptive parents must be college educated. The first couple selected was a lawyer's family, but they wanted a girl. The baby was sent back. The second couple selected was Paul Jobs and Clara Jobs. Paul was a high school educated machinist, and Clara was a bookkeeper. Neither had a college degree. Joanne refused. But after Paul and Clara wrote a pledge promising to send the child to college, she agreed. The pledge had no legal force, but it changed the fate of the child who would be named Steve Jobs. Paul Jobs was a Coast Guard veteran. He had maintained engines on transport ships during World War II. After the war, he settled in San Francisco and worked as an auto mechanic. He had one philosophy: make the unseen parts beautiful. He brought young Steve to the garage, and together they disassembled and reassembled cars. When they built a fence, he sanded even the back of the wood smooth. Nobody will see it, but you'll know, Paul said. Years later, Steve Jobs' insistence that even the unseen back of the Macintosh circuit board be beautifully arranged began in this garage. Clara Jobs came from an Armenian immigrant family. She was a quiet and warm person. She taught Steve to read, and he could already read before entering kindergarten, but school did not suit him. Steve was bored, and boredom in his mind was a dangerous thing. He played pranks in class, tested teachers, and ignored the rules. He was suspended 3 times. Then one teacher recognized him. Imogene Hill, a 4th grade teacher. She offered Steve candy and money if he solved math problems. Within months, Steve was solving problems on his own without any reward. She realized this was not a troublemaker. This was a bored child. On the school's recommendation, Steve skipped a grade. The family moved from Mountain View to Los Altos. In the late 1960s, the area was not yet called Silicon Valley, but HP and Lockheed engineers already lived there. Every garage smelled of circuit boards, and soldering smoke rose every evening. At 12 years old, Steve wanted to build a frequency counter. He needed parts. He opened the phone book and found Bill Hewlett's home number. The co-founder of Hewlett-Packard world's largest electronics company to ask for parts. Bill Hewlett laughed, sent the parts, and offered Steve a summer internship. In 1968, 14-year-old Steve Jobs entered Homestead High School. The Vietnam War was raging, and the counterculture movement was sweeping California. Steve grew his hair long, walked barefoot, and began an extreme vegetarian diet. He immersed himself in Zen Buddhism and experimented with LSD. He later told Isaacson, "Taking LSD was one of the most important things in my life. It showed me there was another side of the coin. I realized that creating something great matters more than making money." A hippie and a businessman, a Zen practitioner and a tyrant, a man who rejected materialism yet would sell the most iconic products in the world. This contradiction was not a flaw, it was Steve Jobs himself. In 1969, 14-year-old Steve Jobs met Steve Wozniak. Wozniak was 5 years older. Their mutual friend Bill Fernandez introduced them. "You're both crazy about electronics, so you should meet." Wozniak was a shy and quiet engineering genius. Jobs was a charismatic visionary. Wozniak could build. Jobs could see. They were a perfect complement. In 1971, Wozniak built the Blue Box. It was an illegal device that mimicked AT&T's phone network frequencies to make free long-distance calls. Jobs immediately saw a business opportunity. They began selling blue boxes to Berkeley students for $150 each. Jobs later said, "If it hadn't been for the blue boxes, there would have been no Apple. What mattered was not the money. It was a revelation. Technology is personal. It can be manipulated, and two kids can change the rules of the world." In 1972, Steve Jobs graduated from high school and enrolled at Reed College in Portland, Oregon. But he dropped out after just one semester. He could not bear the fact that tuition was draining his adoptive parents' entire savings, but he did not leave campus. He slept on the floor of dorm rooms, collected Coke bottle deposits for food money, and ate free meals at the Hare Krishna temple every Sunday night. And he audited only the classes that interested him. One of those was Robert Palladino's calligraphy class. He learned about serif and sans serif, kerning and leading, and the beauty of letter forms. At the time, it seemed like utterly useless knowledge, But 10 years later, that class led to the decision to put beautiful typefaces into the Macintosh. Jobs said at his 2005 Stanford speech, "You can't connect the dots looking forward. You can only connect them looking backward." In 1974, Jobs got a job at Atari, a video game company. At the interview, he said, "I'm not leaving until you hire me." He was hired, but his colleagues despised him. He was arrogant, and he rarely showered because he believed his vegetarian diet eliminated body odor. That year, Jobs left for India. He wandered India for 7 months, seeking spiritual enlightenment. He shaved his head, wore a cotton robe, and walked from village to village. He did not find enlightenment, but he returned with a deep conviction in the power of intuition. In 1975, Jobs returned to California. While he had been away, Wozniak had been building something remarkable, a personal computer. Wozniak wanted to share it for free at the Homebrew Computer Club. Jobs wanted to sell it. On April 1st, 1976, Steve Jobs, Steve Wozniak, and Ronald Wayne founded Apple Computer Company. The startup capital came from selling Jobs' Volkswagen van and Wozniak's HP calculator. $300 in total. Ronald Wayne held a 10% stake, but sold it 12 days later for $800. As of 26, that stake would be worth over $300 billion. The Apple. I was a hand-built circuit board by Wozniak. It had no case, no keyboard, no monitor. About 200 units were sold at 666 each. But it was the beginning. Then Mike Markkula appeared, a 33-year-old retired millionaire from Intel. After visiting Jobs' garage, he invested $92,000 of his own money and secured a $250,000 line of credit. Markkula defined Apple's marketing philosophy in 3 words: empathy, focus, impute. Empathy. Understand the customer's feelings. Focus. Eliminate everything unnecessary. Impute. People judge a book by its cover. The packaging is the product. These 3 words became Apple's DNA for the next 30 years. In April 1977, the Apple II was released. This time, it was different. A plastic case, color graphics, a built-in keyboard, expansion slots. It was the first personal computer that an ordinary person could use at home. When VisiCalc, a spreadsheet application, was made available for it, the Apple sold explosively in both offices and homes. By 1980, Apple's annual revenue exceeded $100 million. On December the 12th of that year, Apple went public. The stock price jumped from the offering price of $22 to $29 on the first day. Steve Jobs, at 25, became a billionaire with a net worth of $256 million. But wealth and success amplified the dark side of his personality. Jobs publicly humiliated employees. "This is shit," was his constant refrain. His reality distortion field, the power to make people believe the impossible was possible, inspired, but it also destroyed people. And then there was Lisa. In 1978, Steve Jobs' ex-girlfriend Chrisanne Brennan gave birth to a daughter. Jobs denied the child was his. A DNA test showed a 94.41% probability that he was the father, but he still denied it. He claimed 28% of the male population of the United States could be the father. He paid only $385 a month in child support. A man worth millions of dollars. Ironically, around the same time, he named a computer being developed at Apple Lisa. Officially, he claimed it stood for Local Integrated Software Architecture. Nobody believed him. A man who had been adopted, abandoned, denied his own biological daughter. He knew better than anyone the wound of being given away, and yet he inflicted the same wound on his own child. It was Steve Jobs' greatest contradiction and his deepest failure. Chapter 2. The Rise. By 1980, Apple was valued at over $1 billion. Steve Jobs was 25 years old, and his face was on the cover of every major magazine. He was the youngest person ever to make the Fortune 500. The boy nobody chose had become the king of Silicon Valley, but success created a new problem. Apple now had thousands of employees, dozens of product lines, and a board of directors that wanted predictability. Jobs wanted revolution. The tension between the artist and the corporation had begun. In December 1979, Jobs visited Xerox PARC, the Palo Alto Research Center. What he saw changed everything. The Xerox Alto computer had a graphical user interface, icons, windows, a mouse pointer. You could click on things instead of typing commands. Jobs was electrified. He later said, "It was like a veil being lifted from my eyes." Xerox had invented the future, but did not know what to do with it. Jobs did. He returned to Apple and demanded that the Lisa computer be rebuilt around a graphical user interface. But in September 1980, he was removed from the Lisa project. The board considered him too volatile, too difficult, too disruptive. So Jobs did what he always did when told no. He found another way. A small team led by Jeff Raskin was working on a low-cost computer project called the Macintosh. Jobs commandeered it. He took over the team, moved them into a separate building, and hung a pirate flag on the roof. "It's better to be a pirate than to join the Navy," he declared. The Macintosh development consumed 3 years, 1981 to 1984. Jobs pushed the team to work 90-hour weeks. He rejected designs dozens of times. He demanded the circuit board inside the case be beautiful, even though no customer would ever see it. "Real artists sign their work," he said, and had every team member's signature engraved on the inside of the case. The original ship date was missed, then missed again. The team was exhausted, but driven by Jobs' relentless vision. Andy Hertzfeld, one of the lead engineers, later recalled, "Working with Steve was both the most exhilarating and the most terrifying experience of my career. He could make you believe you were capable of the impossible." Meanwhile, Jobs had recruited John Scully from PepsiCo to be Apple's CEO in 1983. He lured Scully with one of the most famous lines in business history. "Do you want to sell sugared water for the rest of your life? Or do you want to come with me and change the world?" Scully came. It was the beginning of the end. On January the 22nd, 1984, during Super Bowl VIII, Apple aired a 60-second television commercial directed by Ridley Scott. It cost $750,000 to produce and $1.5 million for the airtime. It showed a dystopian world of grey drones watching a giant screen, an Orwellian Big Brother, and a woman in bright athletic clothes running through the crowd and hurling a sledgehammer at the screen, shattering it. The commercial aired once. It never needed to air again. 2 days later, on January the 24th, 1984, Steve Jobs walked onto the stage at the Flint Center in Cupertino. He was wearing a double-breasted blazer, a bow tie, and a white shirt. He looked nervous. He introduced the Macintosh, and then he let the machine speak for itself. The Macintosh said, in a synthesized voice, "Hello, I am Macintosh. It sure is great to get out of that bag." The audience erupted. People stood and cheered for 5 full minutes. The Macintosh had a 9-inch black and white screen, a mouse, icons you could click, folders you could open, and fonts, beautiful fonts, because of a calligraphy class taken years ago at Reed College. It sold for 2 sols, but the triumph did not last. Within 6 months, Macintosh sales began to collapse. The machine had only 128 kilobytes of RAM, not enough to run complex programs. The floppy disk was painfully slow. There were almost no third-party applications, and 2 phones was far too expensive for most families. The press that had celebrated Jobs now turned on him. Inside Apple, the tension between Jobs and Scully became unbearable. Jobs believed Scully was a corporate bureaucrat who did not understand technology. Scully believed Jobs was an unmanageable genius who was destroying the company. Both were partly right. In early 1985, Macintosh sales had fallen to a fraction of projections. The board stripped Jobs of all operational authority. He was moved to an empty office in a building Apple employees called Siberia. He had a title but no power, no team, no product. In May 1985, Jobs attempted a boardroom coup to remove Scully. He failed. Scully had already secured the board's support. The vote was unanimous against Jobs. The man who co-founded Apple in a garage was now unwanted in the company he had built. On September 17, 1985, Steve Jobs resigned from Apple. He sold all but one of his Apple shares. He was 30 years old. He later told a reporter, "What had been the focus of my entire adult life was gone, and it was devastating. I didn't know what to do for a few months. I felt that I had let the previous generation of entrepreneurs down, but being fired from Apple was not the end of Steve Jobs. It was, as he would later say, the best thing that could have ever happened to him. He just didn't know it yet." Chapter 3. The Exile. After leaving Apple, Jobs did not rest. Within weeks, he founded a new company. He called it Next. The mission was to build the most advanced computer in the world. A machine so powerful and so elegant that universities and researchers would line up to buy it. Jobs poured his obsession into every detail. He hired Paul Rand, the legendary graphic designer who had created logos for IBM, UPS, and ABC, to design the Next logo. He paid Rand $100,000 for a single logo. Rand presented exactly one option: a black cube with the letters N, E, X, T in 4 colors at a 28-degree angle. Jobs accepted it immediately. The Next computer was unveiled on October the 12th, 1988, at the Davies Symphony Hall in San Francisco. It was a perfect 1-foot magnesium cube, black, elegant, and unlike anything the industry had ever seen. It ran on a revolutionary object-oriented operating system called Next Step. It had the first built-in email system with audio attachments. Tim Berners-Lee would later use a Next machine to create the World Wide Web, but the Next computer cost $6,500. Universities could not afford it. Businesses did not want it. The machine was too expensive, too niche, too ahead of its time. Over its entire production run, only about 50,000 Next computers were ever sold. By any commercial measure, Next was a failure. Jobs burned through cash. He micromanaged every detail. The factory robots, the office furniture, the staircase in the lobby. He spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on a staircase, not because it was necessary, but because it was beautiful. The same obsession that made Apple great was now bleeding Next dry. But there was another story unfolding in parallel. In 1986, 1 year after leaving Apple, Jobs bought a small computer graphics division from George Lucas's Lucasfilm. He paid $5 million for the company and invested another $5 million in capital. The company was called Pixar. Pixar was not a film studio. Not yet. It was a hardware company trying to sell specialized imaging computers to hospitals and government agencies. It was losing money every quarter. Jobs kept writing checks. By 1991, he had poured more than $50 million of his own money into Pixar. He nearly sold the company several times. What kept Pixar alive was a small team of animators led by John Lasseter. Lasseter was a former Disney animator who believed computers could tell stories with emotional depth. He had made a short film called Luxo Jr., a 60-second animation of two desk lamps, a parent and a child playing with a ball. It was nominated for an Academy Award. A desk lamp became the Pixar mascot. In 1991, Pixar signed a 3-picture deal with Disney. Disney would finance and distribute the films. Pixar would make them. The first project was an entirely computer-animated feature film about toys that come to life when humans leave the room. It was called Toy Story. The production of Toy Story nearly collapsed. Disney executives, led by Jeffrey Katzenberg, pushed for the film to be edgier and more adult. Woody, the cowboy protagonist, became sarcastic and unlikable. When Disney screened the revised version in late 1993, it was so bad that production was shut down. Lasseter begged for a chance to rewrite the script. He got 2 weeks. Lasseter and his team rewrote the entire script in 2 weeks. They made Woody warm, flawed, and lovable. They gave the film its heart. When the revised version was screened, Disney approved full production. It took 2 more years of grueling work. Toy Story was released on November 26, 1995. It was the first entirely computer-animated feature film in history. It earned $373 million worldwide against a $30 million budget. Critics called it a masterpiece. Children loved it. Adults cried. 1 week later, on November the 29th, 1995, Pixar went public. The IPO was the biggest of the year. Pixar's stock opened at $22 and soared to $49. by the end of the first day, the company was valued at $1.4 billion. Steve Jobs, who owned 80% of Pixar, was now worth over $1 billion again. The Exile had struck gold, but Exile had changed Jobs in other ways too. He married Laureen Powell in 1991 in a ceremony at the Ahwahnee Hotel in Yosemite, officiated by a Zen Buddhist monk. They would have 3 children, Reed, Erin, and Eve. For the first time, Jobs began to build a family life. He also reconciled with his daughter Lisa. It was slow and painful. He had ignored her for years, denied her existence, let her grow up in near poverty while he lived in mansions. But gradually, awkwardly, he let her into his life. She moved into his house as a teenager. The relationship would remain complicated, tender one day, cruel the next, for the rest of his life. During the Exile years, something else was happening. Apple was dying. After Jobs left, the company released dozens of forgettable products. Printers, PDAs, game consoles, digital cameras, even a clothing line. The Macintosh brand was diluted into more than 40 confusing product variations. Market share plummeted from 16% in 1986 to 4% by 1990. The company lost $1 billion in a single year. Apple was 90 days from bankruptcy. In December 1996, Apple's CEO Gil Amelio made a decision that would change everything. Apple needed a modern operating system. They considered buying B Inc., founded by former Apple executive Jean-Louis Gasset. But at the last moment, Amelio chose Next instead. Apple bought Next for $427 million. Steve Jobs was coming home. Jobs returned to Apple not as CEO, but as a special advisor. He had no title, no office, no formal authority. But everyone in the building knew. The king was back. He had been gone for 11 years. He left as a 30-year-old boy who had been humiliated. He returned as a 41-year-old man who had been humbled. The difference would change everything. Chapter 4. The Return. In July 1997, after Apple posted a $1 billion loss the previous year, The board dismissed Gil Amelio. They asked Jobs to become CEO. He refused the title. Instead, he accepted the role of interim CEO, ICEO. He would not even take a salary. He was paid $1 a year. His first act was a ruthless product purge. He gathered his senior staff and drew a simple 2x2 grid on a whiteboard. One axis read Consumer and Professional. The other read Desktop and Portable. 4 squares, 4 products. Everything else would be killed. He cancelled the Newton. He cancelled the printers. He cancelled the servers, the monitors, the digital cameras, the Pippin game console, the clothing line, and dozens of Macintosh models that even Apple employees could not tell apart. He cut the product lineup from over 40 to 4. He laid off more than 3,000 employees. He shut down factories. People called him cruel. People called him heartless. 3,000 people lost their jobs. But Jobs believed that focus meant saying no. And he said no to almost everything. I'm as proud of the things we haven't done as the things we have done, he said. Innovation is saying no to 1,000 things. Then he made a phone call that stunned the entire technology industry. He called Bill Gates. Microsoft invested $150 million in Apple. In return, Microsoft would continue developing Office for the Macintosh. When Jobs announced the deal at Macworld in August 1991, Bill Gates appeared on a giant screen behind him. The audience booed. Jobs silenced them. We have to let go of the notion that for Apple to win, Microsoft has to lose, he said. The result of all this focus was the iMac. It was unveiled on May 6th, 1998, and shipped in August. It was unlike any computer anyone had ever seen. A translucent, Bondi blue, teardrop-shaped all-in-one machine designed by Jonathan Ive, a young English designer who had been quietly working at Apple and whom Jobs recognized as a kindred spirit. The iMac sold 800,000 units in its first 5 months. It became Apple's fastest-selling computer ever. It re-established the I prefix that would define Apple's future. iMac, iPod, iPhone, iPad. The I originally stood for internet, but it came to mean something more: individual, imagination, innovation. Jonathan Ive became Jobs' closest collaborator. Together, they shared a philosophy that design is not how something looks, but how it works. Ive's design studio became the most protected room at Apple. Almost no one was allowed inside. Jobs visited every day. They would sit together for hours, turning prototypes over in their hands, debating the radius of a corner, the weight of a click, the exact shade of white. But Jobs was not finished. He saw that music was the next frontier. In the late 1990s, Napster had torn the music industry apart. Millions of people were downloading songs illegally. The record labels were suing teenagers. Nobody had a legal, convenient solution. Jobs did. On October 23, 2001, Jobs introduced the iPod. It was white, small enough to fit in a pocket, and held 1,000 songs. He described it in 5 words: 1,000 songs in your pocket. The scroll wheel was intuitive. The white earbuds became iconic. Music had never been this personal, this portable, this beautiful. In April 2003, Jobs launched the iTunes Music Store. It sold 1 million songs in its first week. Within 3 years, Apple had become the largest music retailer in the United States, surpassing Walmart and Best Buy. Jobs had not just saved the music industry from piracy, he had rebuilt it on his own terms. Then came the phone. On January the 9th, 2007, at Macworld San Francisco, Steve Jobs walked onto the stage and said, "Every once in a while, a revolutionary product comes along that changes everything. Today, Apple is going to reinvent the phone." He held up a small black rectangle. It had no keyboard, no stylus, no buttons, just a single screen of glass. You touched it with your finger. You scrolled through photos, zoomed into maps, played music, and made phone calls, all on one device. The audience watched in disbelief. Some journalists later said they felt they were watching the future being born. The iPhone went on sale on June the 29th, 2007. People camped outside Apple stores for days. It sold 1 million units in 74 days. Within 6 years, the iPhone generated more revenue than all of Microsoft's products combined. It was not just a phone. It was a pocket-sized computer that redefined how human beings communicate, navigate, photograph, read, shop, and think. On July 10th, 2008, Jobs launched the App Store. It opened with 500 applications. Within 9 months, it had over 50,000 apps and had been downloaded more than 1 billion times. The App Store created an entirely new economy. Independent developers around the world could now build and sell software directly to hundreds of millions of users. It was a platform that generated more commerce than most countries. On January the 27th, 2010, Jobs unveiled the iPad. Critics called it a giant iPhone. They said nobody needed it. It sold 3 million units in 80 days. The tablet became the fastest adopted consumer electronics device in history up to that point. By 2011, Apple's market capitalization surpassed ExxonMobil's, making it the most valuable company in the world. The garage startup, founded with $1,300, was now worth more than $300 billion. Steve Jobs had not just returned to Apple. He had turned it into the most successful business in human history. But there was a secret behind the keynotes, behind the black turtleneck, behind the one more thing. Steve Jobs was dying. He had been dying for years. And the story of his greatest triumph was also the story of his final act. Chapter 5. One More Thing. In October 2003, Steve Jobs had a routine CT scan. A urinary tract problem had been bothering him. The scan found something else, a tumor on his pancreas. The doctors told him it was almost certainly cancer, and that he should expect to live no longer than 3 to 6 months. But a biopsy revealed something unexpected. It was not the common form of pancreatic cancer. The adenocarcinoma that kills 95% of patients within 5 years. It was a rare neuroendocrine tumor, a form that is slow growing and, if caught early, potentially curable through surgery. Jobs had been given a lifeline. He refused it. For 9 months, Steve Jobs refused surgery. He told his wife. He told his board. he told almost no one else. Instead, he tried to treat the cancer with acupuncture, herbal remedies, a strict vegan diet, juice fasts, and consultations with a psychic. He believed he could will the tumor away the same way he had willed products into existence, through sheer force of conviction. His wife begged him. His friends begged him. His doctors begged him. The same reality distortion field that had built Apple was now turned against his own body. He believed the rules did not apply to him, not the rules of business, not the rules of design, and not the rules of biology. In July 2004, 9 months after the diagnosis, Jobs finally agreed to surgery. The Whipple procedure, a complex operation that removes part of the pancreas, the duodenum, and the bile duct, was performed at Stanford University Medical Center. The surgeons opened him up and found that the cancer had spread to 3 of his liver lymph nodes. It was no longer contained. Jobs told the public none of this. He sent an email to Apple employees saying the surgery had been successful and that he would need no chemotherapy and no radiation. Both statements were misleading. The cancer had spread, and the 9 months he had spent refusing surgery may have been the 9 months that made the difference between life and death. On June 12th, 2005, less than a year after his surgery, Steve Jobs stood at the podium at Stanford University's commencement ceremony. He was thin. He looked older than his 50 years, but his voice was steady. He told the graduates 3 stories. The first story was about connecting the dots, how dropping out of Reed College and stumbling into a calligraphy class led to the Macintosh having beautiful typography. You can't connect the dots looking forward, he said. You can only connect them looking backward. So you have to trust that the dots will somehow connect in your future. The second story was about love and loss. How getting fired from Apple at 30 was the best thing that ever happened to him. The heaviness of being successful was replaced by the lightness of being a beginner again, he said. It freed me to enter one of the most creative periods of my life. The third story was about death. He told the graduates about his cancer diagnosis. He told them he had looked death in the face. And then he said, remembering that I'll be dead soon is the most important tool I've ever encountered to help me make the big choices in life. because almost everything, all external expectations, all pride, all fear of embarrassment or failure, these things just fall away in the face of death, leaving only what is truly important. He closed the speech with a line borrowed from the final issue of the Whole Earth Catalogue, a publication he had loved as a young man. Stay hungry, stay foolish. The graduates erupted in applause. Jobs stepped away from the podium and walked off the stage. It was the greatest speech of his life, and it was, in many ways, his farewell. For the next 6 years, Jobs lived 2 lives simultaneously. In public, he was the architect of the most extraordinary product run in business history. Between 2005 and 2011, he launched the iPhone, the App Store, the MacBook Air, the iPad, iCloud, and began planning the Apple Park campus, a circular glass building he called the Spaceship, designed with Norman Foster. He sold Pixar to Disney in 2006 for $7.4 billion in Disney stock, making him Disney's largest individual shareholder and a member of its board. In private, he was deteriorating. The cancer had returned. By 2008, he was visibly thinner. At public events, his black turtleneck hung loose on his frame. Rumors circulated. Apple's stock dropped every time he appeared gaunt. He told the press it was a common bug. It was not. In April 2009, Jobs received a liver transplant at Methodist University Hospital in Memphis, Tennessee. He had been on the transplant waiting list in multiple states, a practice that was legal but controversial for a billionaire. The surgery bought him time, but the cancer was already in his liver. A transplant could not erase what had already spread through his blood. He returned to Apple in June 2009 and threw himself back into work. He was emaciated but relentless. He pushed through the iPad launch in January 2010. He pushed through iCloud. He pushed through the Apple Park design reviews, sitting with Norman Foster and Jonathan Ive, arguing about the curvature of glass panels and the species of trees to be planted in the courtyard. On June 6, 2011, Steve Jobs made his last public appearance at Apple's Worldwide Developers Conference. He was skeletal. His jeans were belted tight. His turtleneck draped over bones. But he walked onto the stage and presented iCloud, OS X Lion, and iOS 5 with the same intensity he had always brought. The audience gave him a standing ovation, not for the products, but for the man. They knew. Everyone in that room knew. On August 24th, 2011, Steve Jobs resigned as CEO of Apple. He sent a letter to the board that read, in part, "I have always said, if there ever came a day when I could no longer meet my duties and expectations as Apple's CEO, I would be the first to let you know. Unfortunately, that day has come." Tim Cook was named CEO. Jobs became chairman of the board. But everyone understood what the letter meant. The man who had said one more thing 100 times had nothing more to give. In the final weeks, Jobs stayed at his home on Waverly Street in Palo Alto. The same modest red brick house. His wife, Lorene, was with him. His children were with him. His sister, Mona Simpson, the biological sister he had found as an adult, was with him. He asked that the windows be kept open. He wanted to feel the air. He spent his last days looking at his family, looking at the trees outside, and occasionally murmuring. Mona Simpson later wrote that in his final hours, he looked at his sister, then at his children, then at his wife, and then over their shoulders, as if seeing something beyond them. His final words, according to Mona Simpson, were, "Oh wow, oh wow, oh wow," said quietly, looking upward, as if seeing something for the first time. Steve Paul Jobs died on October the 5th, 2011, at his home in Palo Alto, California. He was 56 years old. The cause of death was respiratory arrest related to a metastatic pancreatic neuroendocrine tumor. He had been diagnosed 8 years earlier. He had refused surgery for 9 months. Whether those 9 months cost him his life, no one can say for certain. But the question has never gone away. That night, Apple's website was replaced with a single black and white photograph of Steve Jobs and 2 words: Steve Jobs. followed by the dates 1955, 2011. Nothing else. No products. No slogans. Just a face and 2 dates. It was, perhaps, the most powerful piece of design Apple ever produced. Outside Apple stores around the world, people left flowers, candles, apples with bites taken out of them, and handwritten notes. In Palo Alto, strangers stood on the sidewalk outside his house and wept. In Tokyo, Beijing, London, and Sao Paulo, vigils formed spontaneously. A man who had spent his life making devices had touched something that no device could contain. Epilogue. Stay hungry, stay foolish. Steve Jobs was not a good man. He was not a bad man. He was a complicated man. Brilliant and cruel. Visionary and blind. Generous with ideas and stingy with kindness. He changed the world and hurt the people closest to him. He built the most valuable company in history and denied his own daughter. He preached beauty and practiced brutality, his reality distortion field, the force that made engineers believe they could do the impossible, that made audiences believe a phone was a revolution, that made a calligraphy class matter, was also the force that made him believe he could cure cancer with juice. The same trait that built everything also destroyed him. His daughter Lisa wrote a memoir years later called Small Fry. In it, she described a father who could be tender one moment and vicious the next, who once told her she smelled like a toilet, who once held her hand and told her she was beautiful. She wrote, "I wanted him to be my father in the way that most people understand that word. He was my father, but not in the way I needed. But there is something else, something that cannot be reduced to cruelty or genius." In his 2005 Stanford speech, Jobs said, "Your time is limited, so don't waste it living someone else's life. Don't be trapped by dogma, which is living with the results of other people's thinking. Don't let the noise of others' opinions drown out your own inner voice. And most important, have the courage to follow your heart and intuition." He closed that speech with the words, "Stay hungry, stay foolish." He had found them on the back cover cover of the final issue of the Whole Earth catalogue in 1974 when he was 19 years old, barefoot and broke and sleeping on floors. 31 years later, dying of cancer, he gave those words to a generation. Today, more than 3 billion people carry a device that Steve Jobs imagined. The iPhone is in the hands of farmers in India, students in Brazil, doctors in Kenya, and teenagers in Seoul. It is the most widely distributed object ever created by a single company, and it began in a garage in Los Altos, California, with 1,002 Steves. Apple Park, the circular glass campus Jobs designed but never lived to see completed, opened in April 2017. It sits on 175 acres in Cupertino. The main building is a mile in circumference, clad in the largest panels of curved glass ever fabricated. 9,000 trees fill the grounds. Apricot, olive, oak, and apple. Jobs insisted on the apple trees. In the center of Apple Park, there is a theater named after him, the Steve Jobs Theater. It is built into a hillside, its entrance a glass cylinder rising from the grass like a lantern. Every year, Apple unveils its newest products on that stage. And every year, for a brief moment before the lights go down, the room is silent, and his absence is the loudest thing in it. He was born unwanted, given away by his mother, returned by his first adoptive family, raised by a machinist and a bookkeeper who promised to send him to college. He dropped out. He wandered India. He built a computer in a garage. He was crowned. He was exiled. He returned. He changed the world. He ran out of time. 56 years. That was all he got. And in those 56 years, he bent the world closer to the shape he saw in his mind. Not perfectly, not kindly, but completely. This has been Sleep Through History. My name is Edmund. Thank you for listening. Close your eyes now, if you haven't already. Let the story settle. Let the names and dates and places drift. You don't need to remember any of it. Just rest. The world will still be there. In the morning, a little more connected, a little more design, a little more imagined, because a boy nobody chose refused to stop building. Good night.